Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle, 11, The Lake of Dragons. Charles and Aunt Leonis sat at a small round table on the terrace of the Hotel del Lago, eating breakfast. Hurtado had urged them to speak as openly and fully as possible. One never knew what small clue might lead to the murderer or the whereabouts of Simon and Tallis. Then he left them alone and stood at the far end of the terrace. He had his back turned to them and had taken himself out of earshot of their conversation. But they both knew that any untoward movement or word would not escape him. After a while they forgot him. "You dream true," Miss Leonis said when Charles had finished. "It is in all the letters and the journals. You've read them. After the accident with the forklift, which you took as seriously as I did, I kept having the feeling that something was wrong, that I should not have allowed Simon to go with Forsyth. So yes, I read them, and I learned more than I wanted to know about Quentin Farr. He was not the White Knight. Sans pour et sans reproche, I was brought up to believe him to be, though neither was he a scoundrel. For all his folly and over-idealism, he was a man of uncommon valor, vision, and a great deal of charm." She poured herself another cup of lukewarm tea. "I do not understand why Hurtado has no news of Simon," Charles said. "If he's with Canon Tallis, he's all right." Miss Leonis beckoned to Hurtado, who joined them. "Have you found anything out about the papers I gave you last night?" "Madam, I am not a magician." "I am over-impatient. Forgive me. I understand your concern. I should have information on the papers for you by this evening." "Good. It occurs to me that it might also be wise for you to call the museum in Caracas and see if Forsyth did make arrangements there about the portrait." Hurtado looked at her with admiration. "One of my men has already been instructed to do so." "Sir," Charles said, "wouldn't it be a good idea for Aunt Leonis to go to Dragon Lake?" Miss Leonis smiled at the boy. "I am going this morning. Mynheer Vermeer is to accompany me. He'll be here shortly." "He'll be here shortly?" "He's waiting in the lobby," Hurtado said. Then he looked directly at Charles. "What did you dream last night?" Charles's face closed in. Miss Leonis and Hurtado waited. Finally, the boy said, "There may be something in one of the Cristano dwellings which Aunt Leonis ought to see." "And what is that?" Hurtado asked. "I didn't dream clearly enough. If Aunt Leonis is going there, she can look." "Will I be able to?" the old woman asked. "If what I think is there, and if you are meant to see it, you will be able to," Charles said. Hurtado spoke in a deceptively gentle voice. "Young man, do you understand that if I wish to, I can make you tell me whatever it is you dreamed?" Charles gave him an unexpected smile. "You're Canon Tallis's friend, so I know there are certain things you won't do." Hurtado's jaw did not relax. "I wouldn't be too certain of that." Charles said, "You know that I can't tell you something deadly serious when I'm not sure. When Aunt Leonis gets back from Dragon Lake, then I'll tell you." Hurtado said, "The two of you are a pair. I'm surprised that you are not the nephew. You will tell me what you feel like telling me when you feel like telling me." He snorted. "Please understand that a man has been murdered. The murderer is at large, and we do not know where Simon and Tom Tallis are." "I do recognize that," Charles said somberly. "That's why I can't tell you anything which might be misleading." "Let me be the judge of that," Hurtado said. Charles only shook his head. "Tonight." Hurtado tucked Aunt Leonis into the Hispano Souza beside the benevolent Vermeer, who wore, instead of his solar toupee, an English straw boater. Miss Leonis had on the thin blue and white dress described by Charles, an ancient leghorn sun hat, and carried her lace parasol. Vermeer started the engine, revving it fiercely, then nosed uphill through a narrow street, the houses brightly painted with warm sunny colors, reds, oranges, yellows, and cooler summer colors, varied shades of greens and blues. Despite her anxiety, Miss Leonis looked about with pleasure. Vermeer pointed. "If you look through the open doors, you can see courtyards and gardens." Try that again. Vermeer pointed. "If you look through the open doors, you can see courtyards and gardens. I live in such a house. It's very pleasant, though hotter in summer than a Dutchman is accustomed to. He drove around the corner into a large square with a rococo bandstand, flowering cactus, tall lush trees, towering palms. Plaza Boulevard. After the cool breeze of the plaza, they drove through what appeared to be the main street. Vermeer pointed out bank and post office. All soldiers and policemen are with guns. Oh, all the soldiers and policemen with guns, Miss Leonis said, in front of the bank and the post office, and there, that policeman controlling traffic, with his rifle slung and ready. Is this the custom in Port of Dragons? Port of Dragons is close to the border, and the bandits come across too often for comfort. There's also a sizable band of Cubans in the hills, and the city officials are afraid of revolution. With reason? She asked. Without answering, Vermeer turned the car and drove rapidly down a long street of brightly colored row houses. Suddenly the houses began to be separated and set in flower-filled gardens, and then they drove past prosperous and beautiful villas, cheek by jowl, with shacks made out of rusty corrugated metal and a few planks. The well-kept and imposing houses became fewer and farther apart, and without warning they were driving through a camp of rickety shacks. A sour and acrid stench assailed their nostrils. It looks like a refugee village. Miss Leonis held her handkerchief to her nose. It's not. It's the barrio. Ciudad de Promos, the port of Port of Dragons. Is this exceptional? Oh no, you will find this everywhere. I understand why you did not answer my question about revolution, she said. At home we see a few shacks, but never a whole city of them like this. They certainly can't be waterproof. They're not. What happens in a heavy rain? Vermeer's perpetual grin seemed to widen. A lot of them wash into the sea. The grin did not deceive her. How do you stand it? He shrugged. I do what I can. It is not enough. She looked at the shacks. They seemed to steam in the heat. The laundry hung limp and dirty-looking on the lines. There's no easy answer, Vermeer said. At La Guaira, the government built several beautiful high-rise buildings on the waterfront. The people moved out of their shacks and into the apartments, and shortly thereafter, most of them moved back to the shacks where they can have their goat and their garden patch, and where the home, bad as it is theirs. A group of naked children with bloated bellies waved at the car. Miss Leonis and Vermeer waved back. Then the barrio was behind them, and Vermeer drove along a superhighway through a scrubland not unlike some of South Carolina. Vermeer said it was called Monte. On either side of the highway were booths where Indians were selling touristy gifts. Though Miss Leonis wondered how many tourists would come here, it was hardly a resort area. There were also a number of booths with roofs of palm and banana leaves where native men were stopping to drink. Miss Leonis disciplined herself to observe what was going on around her and not to think about Simon or what was going to happen when they reached the Quistano village. She asked, "What are they drinking?" "Coconut milk." Vermeer slowed down as they passed the next stand so she could see that the milk was not solid out of the coconut, but was poured in and out of two pitchers. They had sugar, water, and ice, so that the coconut milk gets dirty and diluted. She watched as the server hacked several coconuts open with a machete, unplugged them, poured the milk into one of the pitchers, and threw out the coconut with all its meat. "It looks highly unsanitary," Miss Leonis said, as Vermeer accelerated. "But the countryside reminds me of home. No wonder Quentin Farr was happy to stay in North America. We don't have these tall cactus trees, but we do have the palms, and the oleander, and the bougainvillea." The highway narrowed, and they drove through a village which Vermeer told her was typical of the area. It was gaudy and crowded, houses, shacks, villas, all crammed in together with no plan or pattern. In the center of the town was a square with a big, beautiful church. In front of the carved wooden doors was a little huddle of old men and women in black. Miss Leonis regarded it carefully. In North Florida, where some of Quentin Farr's property was, there's Spanish architecture too. Vermeer pointed. Pigs! She looked, and several large pigs were wandering around the central fountain of the square. Shops crowded out onto the street with Christmas tree lights still strung up. Possibly, she thought, they never take them down. The houses are interesting, Vermeer said. Look at that one, so shabby and poor, and yet you can see through the open door that the furniture is new and chrome. And it has always seemed strange to me that the largest and most prosperous villas front directly onto the street, just like the shacks, instead of facing the river, which flows behind them. What kind of people live here? Miss Leonis asked. What do they do for a living? They left the village and drove across a long suspension bridge. Most of them are involved in the oil industry, in one way or another, Vermeer said, and ahead of them they could see what appeared to be hundreds of round oil tanks. Suddenly the lake was on their right, and Miss Leonis drew in her breath in surprise. Far into the lake sprouted the tall metal towers of oil wells. Vermeer drew up to the shore and stopped his Hispano Suiza. With a flourish, sprang out and opened the door for Miss Leonis. She stood beside him under the completely inadequate shade of her parasol. She felt that she was in some kind of hell. Not only was the heat fierce, but excess gas from one of the wells burst in flame from a pipe just a few feet away. Around the spouting flame, heat quivered visibly in the air. Nearby were several official-looking buildings, outside which armed soldiers lounged. Miss Leonis said, I can see why there have to be men with rifles. All these oil wells must represent millions and millions of dollars. If there should be a revolution, it would be quite a coup, and the United States would be just as upset as Venezuela. We depend on all that oil. No wonder even the traffic cops seem ready to shoot on the slightest provocation. Vermeer nodded. There is great wealth here, next to Maracaibo. It is the greatest wealth in Venezuela. Nor should one forget that the oil wells provide a reasonable standard of living for a great many people who would starve otherwise. Miss Leonis looked down at her feet, where black sludge oozed heavily out of the lake. It looks to me as though the oil industry is raping the lake. That is for people like Dr. O'Keefe to decide. One thing I have learned in 3 years at Port of Dragons is that there are no easy solutions. It's like something out of Dante's Inferno, she said. Some of those towers look as though they might be able to stride across the water like robots. I have had nightmares about them legging across the land and through the town, the Dutchman said, but it makes me think of the English H.G. Wells rather than Dante. Shall we continue our journey now? I thought it a pity not to show you the oil wells, since our route goes right by them. They got back in the car. Miss Leonis settled herself. I'm glad to have seen the oil wells, although I do not find them reassuring, and I feel in need of reassurance. The road narrowed so that 2 cars would have had difficulty in passing. The Monte pressed in on it. Through trees on their left, Miss Leonis could see glimpses of the lake. They were beyond oil wells now, and the water shimmered in the sunlight. She pulled her leghorn hat forward to shade her eyes from the glare. Her heart ached. There should have been word of Simon by now. Perhaps she and Charles were both wrong to hold back information. They could have no idea what might mean something to Hurtado, and Vermeer had a keen intelligence behind his idiotic grin. Vermeer turned toward her. Only a few miles now, and then we will make the rest of the journey in a canoe. Splendid. You do not object to the canoe? My dear young man, I was canoeing in Cyprus black waters around Faro long before you were born. I can tell an alligator from a log in an emergency. I'm still a good swimmer. Perhaps during the next few minutes you will tell me why this trip to Dragon Lake is so important to you. I will tell you, she said. For the first time, Vermeer looked at her without a smile. On the Orion, Hurtado moved from passenger to passenger, officer to officer, sailor to sailor. His jaw appeared to grow darker with each interview, but his eyes retained their sharpness, and his expression remained impassive. He spent more time with Yan than with anybody else. In the jungle, Simon and Canon Talus struggled to keep their fire going. "Will we have to spend another night here?" Simon asked. "It's possible. Not to worry about it now. We managed last night." "Some of those animals came pretty close to us." "We'll have to keep the fire going." "Do you think anyone's seen our smoke?" "The jungle is extraordinarily thick and our smoke is fairly thin." "What kind of animals do you think they were last night?" "Could be many different kinds, from wood mice to wild boar." "Snakes?" "We have to watch for snakes as we collect wood, Simon. I don't think they'll bother us at night. How about looking for some more berries? Our frugal breakfast seems a long time ago." "All right, sir." Canon Talus handed him one of the 2 spears he had fashioned during the night. "You're not apt to need this as long as you're careful, but you might as well take it with you. And do not go out of sight of the fire. Better to be hungry than separated." "Is it going to be all right, sir?" Canon Talus adjusted his palm sun hat. "In terms of eternity, of course it is going to be all right. But in terms of right now, no use borrowing trouble, Simon." "You think Hurtado will find us?" "Yes, I do. I do think that he will find us, but I can't promise that he will." Simon turned away. "Aunt Leonis doesn't make promises unless she's positive either. But if you think he's going to find us, that's good enough for me. I'll try to find more berries. If I climb up and get a coconut, do you think we can get into it?" "I think so," the canon said. "I've found 2 good fat rocks we could use for crushing purposes." We're really managing very well, aren't we?" "We're an extraordinary pair." "Aunt Leonis is going to be very worried about us, and so are Polly and Charles and Mr. Theo. I'm very glad your senior Commandant Hurtado knows about us." Miss Leonis sat in the center of a large dugout canoe. Vermeer was in front and occasionally turned around to nod reassuringly. A young man from the Custano village sat in the stern and paddled deftly and swiftly. He was long-limbed and fine-boned, and the golden bronze of his skin seemed to be lit from within. He wore a short orange tunic, belted in leather with a knife case. The acanthic folds of his eyes slanted up toward the temples on either side, reminding her of the eyes of young warriors in early Greek sculpture. He told them his name was Uldi, and that he had been sent by Umar Zanai to guide them, and that he spoke English and Spanish, but that was all the information he gave them. His face was as impassive as Hurtado's, and he paddled swiftly and in silence, his oar knifing the water without a splash. The trip on the lake was cooled by a light wind which ruffled the water. If Miss Leonis had not been beset by anxiety and misgivings, she would have enjoyed it. Now that they were nearly there, she felt herself trembling in anticipation. She could not escape the thought that Simon might be the next young fair to be cut down. She tried to eradicate this horror by thinking of Charles. What did he expect her to see at Dragon Lake? Could it possibly be Simon? "Look," Vermeer pointed. Ahead of them in the lake, small round buildings on high stilts stretched out in the water, somewhat like the oil wells. But where the oil wells had seemed alien and sinister, the Quistano village appeared to her to be natural and delightful. It is probably very much the same way it looked when Quentin first came here, she thought. It was certainly exactly as he had described it. Her old eyes rested on the pleasant scene almost with a sense of déjà vu. Half of each circular building was enclosed by a panel of loosely woven straw screening. As they approached the house furthest from the water, Miss Leonis saw a young woman slide the matting around so that the interior of her dwelling would be protected from the sun. All around the circumference of the small and airy building, flowers were blooming. The whole village, she realized, was bright with flowers. The roofs of the small dwellings, like those of the coconut sellers, were covered with palm or banana leaves. Small boats were tied to the slender pilings of many of the dwellings. Oldie paddled swiftly toward the shore, past the stork-like dwellings, under several of them. On shore, many canoes were pulled up onto the beach out of the water, and she could see a sizable group of people assembled to watch their arrival. No sign of Simon. 4 young men detached themselves from the group and ran splashing through the water to pull the canoe high up onto the sand. Vermeer jumped out, holding out his hands in greeting. Oldie, still expressionless, picked Miss Leonis up and set her down gently on the beach. She stood there and looked about her. Had she really expected to see Simon? Not really. It was a forlorn hope. If it had been Simon, Charles would have been more definitive. Then what did he expect her to see? There were not many houses on land as in the water. There were not as many houses on land as in the water. A few of the round stilted dwellings, and most impressive of all the buildings, 2 long rectangles with flower-filled verandas. Between the 2 large buildings, in the center of the greensward, was a large statue. From a distance she could not tell whether it was carved from wood or stone. It was the figure of a woman, inordinately tall, flowing in graceful lines from earth to sky, so that it seemed to belong to both. Quentin had mentioned the statue of a goddess, and that her religion was important to the Umara, and it seemed to him no worse than any other form of worship. Religion, to Quentin, was women's work. Behind the greensward, the jungle reached upward to become a mountain, looming high into the sky. There was a fresh, flower-scented breeze blowing through the village, and a sense of calm and cleanliness. Though the stilted dwellings had a light and windswept look, they were far more substantial than the hovels in the barrio. The mountain itself protected the village rather than overwhelming it. The villagers reflected the exuberant colors of their flowers. The young men wore short-colored tunics. On the older men, the tunics were larger. The women were flowing, brightly patterned. The women wore flowering, brightly patterned gowns. Everywhere was poinciana scarlet, jacaranda azure, laburnum flame. No wonder Quentin could plan to make his life here. Vermeer was shaking hands with the assembled group, and seemed to know some of them intimately. He bowed low to an old man in a long white robe who came from one of the round dwellings on the greensward. The old man embraced Vermeer, kissing him first on one cheek, then on the other, and thirdly, ceremoniously on the forehead. The Dutchman returned the 3 kisses with joyful formality. "I greet you, Umar Zanai, and I bring you one who has news of the long-gone one. Her name is Miss Leonis Fair, and she herself is in the line of the fair." The old man bowed courteously. "You bring us news, Signora Fair." She shook her head. "Sir, I come hoping for news. Do you know where my nephew is?" Umar Zanai replied, "We know nothing of a nephew. We await the fair." Miss Leonis's disappointment was acute, but she said only, "Yes, I know. That is why I'm here. I have come to find the past, and now I look for Simon. Simon Bolivar Quentin Fair Rainier, a descendant of your fair." The old chieftain gestured, and 2 young men ran lightly up the steps to the larger of the round houses, and returned with a chair made of young trees laced together with vines. When Miss Leonis was seated, one of the young men took her parasol and shaded her with it, while a boy barely past childhood, no older than Simon, fanned her with a palm leaf. Again, Umar Zanai bowed over her hand with Western courtesy. She stiffened as she saw a litter being carried out of the dwelling from which her chair had come. On the litter was a small figure in a silvery blue robe. Uldi said in his rather flat voice, "It is Umara. She is so old now that she can no longer walk. She eats and drinks a little. She spends her time in fasting and prayer." The Umara was attended by 2 women in long gowns of silvery blue like moonlight. The litter was carried close to Miss Leonis's chair, and she could see that the woman sitting on it was indeed very old, much older than she herself. The skin did not have the interior glow of the other Quistanos, but was the gray-brown of a coconut. She wore a turban, and Miss Leonis suspected that she had little or no hair. Her skull showed clearly through the almost transparent skin. Her eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, but they seemed to pierce. Umar's eye beckoned to Oldie. The young man hurried to him, and the old chief dropped one arm lightly on the shoulders of Oldie's orange tunic. Your escort, Senora Fair, is one of my great-grandsons. Several greats, I should say, Vermeer remarked. Oldie is barely out of boyhood. You should not worry so much about the bindings of time, the old man said. Then he turned to Miss Leonis. Oldie has just returned to us. He has been away at the big university. Our friend Vermeer arranged for it. So, Oldie, now you will serve as interpreter. I am too old for long conversing in strange tongues, and the Umara tires even more easily. The ancient Umara spoke a few words and began to laugh. Oldie said, She says that she was told that an old one was coming, and she laughs because the Miss Farr is so young. He stopped, cocking his head to listen as the Umara spoke again, this time with no laughter. She wants you to know if you have the memory. She wants to know if you have the memory that goes beyond death. Perhaps. Oldie listened again, his head on the slender stalk. Oldie listened again, his head on the slender stalk of neck cocked like a bird's. She wants to know where the fair is. Miss Leonis was surprised to have Vermeer speak to her without a trace of a smile. Please be careful how you answer, he said. She turned to Oldie, thought for a moment, and said, I do not know where he is, and this causes me much anxiety. The Umara nodded in satisfaction at her response. Again, we have sent hunters out to look for him. As they found him before, so they will find him now. The jungle is very large, Miss Leonis said. How will they know where to look? They will go where they found the fair the first time. And if he is not there, he will be there. Already we have had messages that smoke has been seen. He will be there. Despite her misgivings, Miss Leonis caught hope from the strength of the Umara's conviction. The ancient woman continued, And now we two must speak alone together. You will come to my dwelling with Oldie to speak for us. She waved her stick-thin arm imperiously, and the litter was raised. The two moonlight-clad women came immediately to her side. Now Miss Leonis noted that, though both seemed to her to be young, there may be over a generation separating them. She guessed they were being trained in the duties of the Umara, from whose point of view anybody over 100 must be young. Anybody under 100 must be young. Oldie helped Miss Leonis rise from the low and supple chair, which had been gentle to her tired bones. He spoke in the strange liquid syllables of the Quistano, which reminded Miss Leonis of flowing water, and which was completely different from the flat intonation with which he spoke English. The two youths who held parasol and fan moved along with them over the greensward, which was soft and springy under their feet. She moved as though in a dream. Perhaps fatigue and the automatic anesthesia of over-anxiety accounted for her lack of emotion at this extraordinary situation. She asked, What are the two long rectangular buildings on either side of the statue? They are the caring places of the fair. What does that mean? Ualdi replied. They are the caring places for those who are dying, for those who are ill and may with care recover. She stopped. The two youths with parasol and fan quickly stepped back to shade her. What did my ancestor, the fair, have to do with all this? It was his thought that the Quistano should have special places in which to provide care. We have always had the gift, but the idea of the caring places came from the Englishman, and it was with him that we made the first one. Miss Leonis looked at the great statue. She could see now that it had originally been carved of wood, but was so old that the wood had acquired the patina of stone. The face was severe, the lips were quirked in a slight smile which gave a feeling of delight. The carved eyes, however, were as dark and enigmatic as Waldy's. Who is... Waldy looked up at the statue and returned its smile. Until I went away for my studies, I understood better than I understand now. She is the one through whom we see the stars and hear the wind. Your goddess. Perhaps I would call her that now, though I think I would be wrong, for she is not what she is. She is more than she is. We do not worship her or pray to her. As some of the people in the cities pray to their plaster saints in gaudy churches, the Umara prays through her, as does Umarzanai. And the rest of you, prayer too is a gift. We do not all have it, but we benefit from those who do. Miss Leonis did not move toward the dwelling of the Umara. She looked at the two long, airy carrying places. Those, we would call them hospitals today, would we not? Waldy laughed, but there was no pleasure in his laughter. Ha! I think not. When I was at the big university, I got a terrible pain in my side, and I was taken to the hospital, and my appendix was removed. I would not want anybody I love to be ill in the big city hospital. No, these are caring places. 2 caring places for a small village. Are the Quistanos often ill, then? Seldom. We are strong and live long, not as long as the Umara, for we do not have her need and promise to keep, but long. But who are the caring places for, then? For any who may need them. When the Fair and his Umara started them, it was for those injured in the wars, liberator or royalist, it did not matter. Many men who were left to die lived because they were brought to us for caring, and those who died did not die alone. We helped them make the journey from here to there. You talk as though you had been there. It is part of the memory, Waldy said. I share in it. Miss Leonis looked again at the statue. There isn't war here now. Who is in the caring places? She looked toward the long buildings. The porches were bright with flowers. The screens were adjusted to provide shade. Uldi followed her gaze. Those who are ill, hungry, filled with the diseases of poverty and starvation. There are some ill from the fish in the far section of the lake. You must have driven by the barrio. Yes, Miss Leonis said. What happens when the caring places are full? Waldy shook his head. They often are, but they hold as many as we can care for at one time. The people from the barrio come to us. They bring their babies to us. They know that we will care for them and help them make the journey through the valley of death, if that is the destination. Who does the caring? Those men and women of the Quistanos who have the gift, those who have been called to give their lives to the caring places. One must be very strong to go through the other side of night with the dying and then return. And Quentin Fair, he started all this. I don't know about Quentin, but the Fair started many things, Waldy said. Both good and bad. He made promises and broke them, and there are those who are still angry. Here among the villages. No, the Umara and Umarzanai will not permit anger and hate to remain in our midst. Each generation there are those who leave here and make their way in the cities. Some of them are filled with a sick desire for vengeance, and although they are no longer Quistanos, they drink and talk about the Quistano revenge and their lost heritage. Hatred is not the way to bring the Fair back. She said, You have left the village and gone to the city, and you did not stay there. You returned. I am betrothed to an Umara. Would you have returned otherwise? I think that I would. At the university, I learned much, including that I do not like much of what is supposed to be civilization. Now, Senora Fair, I have talked with you for too long. We must not keep the Umara waiting. He took her arm and urged her forward. When they reached the Umara's dwelling place, he gestured to the youths with parasol and fan to wait outside. and helped Miss Leonis up the steep steps. The Umara's 2 waiting women were adjusting the screens to provide the maximum shade and breeze, and as they slid the screens around, a shaft of sunlight pierced the interior and spotlighted a man's face. Miss Leonis felt her heart thud crazily within her chest. The man was not alive. It was a portrait. The portrait of Simón Bolívar. And we will pause there.